you could be born free in New York and still legally belong to someone else. Not as an error, not as an exception, as the law. The state had passed an Emancipation Act. Politicians called it progress. And in the years that followed, newspapers printed the word liberty on nearly every page. But for the people that law was supposedly written for, the ones waiting inside it, freedom was not an event. It was a deadline. Decades away. This Reconstruction draws from legislative acts, court records, census data, and archival scholarship. AI is used only to visualize documented history. By the early 1800s, New York City was already one of the most powerful commercial centers in the Western world. Ships filled the harbor. Wealth moved through counting houses and merchant offices. The city was loud, ambitious, and growing fast. And threaded through all of it, the kitchens, the dockyards, the workshops, the grand homes of Lower Manhattan, was a system of forced labor this city depended on completely. How that system was built, how it was sustained, and what it actually cost to survive inside it. That is what this documentary examines. Most people picture slavery as Southern, plantations, rural isolation, fields stretching past the horizon. New York looked nothing like that. But in 1800, New York City held more enslaved people than any other city in the northern states. Over 2,000 men, women and children, legally owned, living inside one of the most commercially active urban centers in the new republic. This was not hidden. It was not marginal. It was ordinary. Enslaved people walked the same cobblestone streets as merchants and lawyers. They appeared in the same city directories. In some neighborhoods, slavery was simply part of the landscape, unremarkable to those who benefited from it. New York's slavery was distributed, spread across hundreds of individual households, clergymen, ship captains, craftsmen, politicians. Most slaveholders here owned 1, 2, perhaps 3 people. Small numbers per household, but accumulated across an entire city. The scale was significant, and because it was diffuse, it was easy to look past. It did not announce itself the way a plantation did. It had no fields, no overseers on horseback, no obvious geography of control. It blended into the rhythm of daily commerce. A system that looks normal is a system that endures. Urban slavery did not look like field labor. It looked like a city running smoothly. In the households of Manhattan's merchant class, enslaved people managed the full operations of domestic life. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children. They maintained the comfort of families who rarely acknowledged the labor behind it. Outside those homes, the work was harder. On the docks, enslaved men loaded and unloaded cargo alongside paid laborers. Barrels, sea rates, bales of cotton and sugar moving through one of the busiest ports in the Atlantic world. The work was identical. The difference was the wage. One group received it, the other did not. In skilled trades, the picture grew more complex. Enslaved carpenters, blacksmiths and coopers worked at high levels of craft. Their skills were known. Their output had real market value. But the income that work generated belonged entirely to their owners. A man could be respected for his trade on Monday and sold by Friday. Skill offered no protection. Reputation offered no security. What urban slavery required was not a plantation. It required a city already organized around commerce, and a legal structure willing to attach forced labor to every layer of that economy. The labor was everywhere. The people providing it remained legally invisible. In 1799, New York State passed a law. It was called the Gradual Emancipation Act, and the word gradual was doing enormous work. The law did not free a single person on the day it passed. It did not release anyone from their legal obligations to an owner. What it created instead was a framework, a slow, carefully engineered transition designed to protect the economic interests of slaveholders first. Here is what it actually said. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th, 1799, would one day be free, but not immediately, not for decades. Male children would remain legally bound to their mother's owner until the age of 28. Female children until 25. Born free, but bound. A child born the day that law passed would spend their entire childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood inside the household that had always controlled their mother. He would work without wages, without choice, without exit. The law used the language of liberation. The structure it created looked remarkably similar to what had existed before it. Abolitionists saw the contradiction immediately. So did the people the law was written about. Freedom had been promised, but the terms of that promise were written entirely by people who were not waiting for it. The 1799 law created a new kind of household, one where legal status depended entirely on when you were born. A mother could be enslaved. Her child, born after July 4th, 1799, technically free but bound to the same owner for 25 to 28 years. A father might have already purchased his own freedom. His wife still owned, his children bound. 3 people, 3 different legal statuses, one household. The paperwork said different things about each of them. Daily life made no such distinctions. And as July 4th, 1827 drew closer, the date when full emancipation would finally arrive, something darker began to happen. Some slaveholders in New York did not wait. Rather than release the people they owned, they sold them. South, to Georgia, to Louisiana. To states where no emancipation date existed, where no deadline was coming. It was illegal under certain conditions. It happened anyway. A person who had spent their entire life in New York, who would watch that? 1827. Date approach like a fixed point on the horizon, could be loaded onto a ship and gone before it arrived. The law promised freedom. It did not always deliver it in time. For some families, the clock ran out before the date did. Some people did not wait for 1827. They had already been freed by individual agreement, by purchase, by legal manumission. They carried documents to prove it. These were called freedom papers. A folded piece of paper, a name, a physical description, a signature from a judge or former owner. It was the only thing standing between a free person and re-enslavement. And it was not enough. In the cities and towns of the northeastern states, a specific crime had become common enough to require its own legislation. Free black men and women were being seized off streets, out of homes, away from their families, and sold south as enslaved people. No trial, no hearing. By the time anyone looked for them, they were gone. In 1808, New York became the first state in the nation to pass a law specifically labelled to prevent the kidnapping of free people of colour. That law existed because the crime was real, documented, widespread. But laws require enforcement. Courts moved slowly. Witnesses disappeared. And a person already on a ship heading south had very little recourse from the deck. Freedom papers gave legal standing. They did not guarantee safety. For free black New Yorkers, the distance between legal freedom and actual security remained dangerously wide. New York had no plantations. But New York had money. And that money was deeply structurally connected to the plantation system operating across the American South. The merchants of Lower Manhattan financed Southern cotton production. They extended credit to planters in Georgia and Mississippi. They moved the harvests north and then across the Atlantic. The profits landed in New York. The banks formalized it. Loans issued by New York financial institutions were frequently secured against enslaved people as collateral. A planter could borrow money by listing the people he owned as assets. New York banks accepted those terms. The paperwork was ordinary. The transactions were routine. Insurance companies went further. Enslaved people were insured as property against loss, escape, and death. New York underwriters issued those policies. They calculated the risk. They collected the premiums. None of this required a single plantation on New York soil. The city did not need to own the system directly. It needed only to finance it, insure it, and move its product. That was enough. New York's prosperity in the early 19th century was not separate from American slavery. It was built on top of it, one transaction at a time, in offices 2 blocks from the harbour. The distance between Wall Street and a cotton field was financial, not moral. In New York, slavery and freedom lived within walking distance of each other, sometimes within the same block. Free black New Yorkers and enslaved people shared neighborhoods, markets, and churches. They knew each other. They were sometimes related. The boundary between their legal statuses was real, but geographically it was invisible. That proximity created its own kind of pressure. For enslaved people, the presence of free black neighbors was a constant reminder of what was possible and how far away it remained. For free black New Yorkers, proximity to the enslaved carried its own danger. Association could invite suspicion. Suspicion could invite scrutiny. And scrutiny in this city had consequences. White New Yorkers who depended on enslaved labor had a practical interest in maintaining order. That interest expressed itself in surveillance, in curfews, in regulations governing where black New Yorkers, free or enslaved, could gather, move, and organize. Chatisha's city had passed laws restricting public assembly. Tavern owners were prohibited from serving black customers after certain hours. Movement through the city was watched. Control did not require a plantation overseer. In an urban environment, the architecture of control was social. It was embedded in the street, in the law, in the daily interactions of a city that needed the labor but feared the people providing it. Against all of that, the surveillance, the legal fragility, the economic exclusion, something was being built. Quietly, deliberately. from the inside. Black churches in New York were not simply places of worship. They were organizational infrastructure. They were where information moved, where mutual aid was coordinated, where communities made decisions about their own futures. The church was one of the few spaces where black New Yorkers could gather with some degree of autonomy. Mutual aid societies formed alongside them. Networks of people pooling resources to pay legal fees, to support families separated by sale, to assist those who had been freed but had nothing to begin with. And then there was the African Free School. Founded in 1787, it educated thousands of black children in New York across the decades that followed. It was established by the New York Manumission Society, an organization dedicated to the gradual abolition of slavery. Among its founding members, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, both men at various points in their lives had owned enslaved people. The institution they helped create nonetheless educated the generation that would march in 1827. That contradiction, reformers who were also slaveholders building schools for the children of the enslaved, was not unusual for this period. It was, in many ways, the defining tension of it. By 1817, the political pressure had become difficult to ignore. The Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799 had set a process in motion. But it had not set a final date. Thousands of people remained legally enslaved in New York. Adults, not children born after 1799, with no clear endpoint in sight. That year, the New York State Legislature passed a new law. It was direct. It was specific. July 4th, 1827 would be the date. Every enslaved person remaining in New York would be legally free on that morning. For the first time, freedom had a fixed point on the calendar. The response was not uniform. Some slaveholders began the process of legal manumission. Others accelerated their resistance, selling people south, as had been happening for years before the deadline could arrive. The closer 1827 came, the more urgent that illegal traffic became. And alongside all of this, a quieter fact was accumulating weight. Black New Yorkers had served in the defense of the state during the War of 1812. They had fought. They had contributed. That service was part of the public record, and it added momentum to the argument that full emancipation was not generosity. It was overdue. The date was set. The city knew it was coming. What no one fully said aloud was how much would still remain unresolved when it arrived.
Quite a morning, isn't it?
The date arrived. July 4th, 1827. By law, by legislative act, by a process that had taken nearly 3 decades, slavery in New York was over. But the celebration did not happen on July 4th. It happened on July 5th. Black New Yorkers made that choice deliberately. They would not march on the same day as white Independence Day celebrations. The separation was not bitterness. It was not protest in the modern sense. It was clarity. The 4th of July belonged to a narrative of American freedom that had not included them. The 5th was their own. An estimated 4,000 people marched down Broadway. It was one of the largest public processions the city had ever seen. There were speeches, there was music, there were families who had waited their entire lives for this morning. The joy was real, and it was careful, because the people marching knew something the date itself could not resolve. They had lived inside this city long enough to understand the difference between a legal declaration and a lived reality. Slavery had ended. What that meant, practically, economically, politically, was still being determined. The march moved down Broadway in the summer heat, and the city watched.
We should hurry. The light is fading.
The march ended. The speeches concluded.
Yes.
July 5th became July 6th, and the city continued largely as it had before. 6 years earlier, in 1821, the New York State Constitutional Convention had convened with a specific purpose: to expand voting rights. It succeeded. For white men, the property requirement to vote was removed entirely. Universal white male suffrage was established. For black men, the convention moved in the opposite direction. Those who had previously voted under the older property requirements that applied equally now faced a new threshold: $250 in property ownership, minimum, to cast a ballot. Most could not meet it. Voting rights that some black New Yorkers had actually held were effectively removed. This did not happen after 1827. It happened 6 years before slavery itself ended, while people were still legally owned in the same state. Freedom arrived. The vote, for most, did not come with it. Economic marginalization continued. Certain trades closed off. Certain neighborhoods hardened. The patterns forming in these years would define black life in New York for generations. Slavery as a legal institution was gone. The conditions it had produced were not. History is not only made by leaders, it is endured by ordinary people, through laws written against them, and freedoms that arrived incomplete. If this is the history you want to examine, not as legend, but as lived experience, stay with us. There is more to uncover.